Hello and welcome back. I'm just going to jump right back into the video, and this time I'm jumping into minute 56:41 about Frankish and on feel and function. So let's see where that goes.
But here's my last one. You already kind of touched on it. It was just so Keith Frankish, he's posited that we, conscious realists, have a deep problem when we separate feel from function. So you already mentioned that basically, and that it is extremely extravagant. He states that when we do this separation, he would just apply a modus tollens and not make a separation. But you think about it and you say, like, we idealists, we don't need to do this though. Function or behavior is the appearance of the phenomenal, or as some just say, the intrinsic nature is phenomenal. And
We idealists, it's sort of, kind of a Freudian slip, you could say something along those lines, right? We idealists, it's a group think. It's a congregation. It's not my philosophy. He has accepted that he's a part of a collective illusion, and the name of that collective illusion is idealism. That's the whole idea of isms. Isms are illusions. There is your philosophy. There's my philosophy, and that potential guy over there's philosophy, and so on. Ism is dogmatic, right? It's a dogma. It is, these are the rules of our thinking, right? It's embedded in the expression of these people, right? The philosophy has become something that has almost its own existence, and and now people are. It's almost like creating a god, philosophical god, or something along those lines, right? Now the god has said this is how it is. The ism of our god is right. The problem with these people is this ism has to be shaped such that it imitates an already established ism called Christianity, right? Another so that there's sort of this springboard between Christianity, ism, and explanation, right? Because the book, the holy book, the James Bible or whatever the fuck it's called, right, is not sufficiently philosophical to convince modern people of the blessings of religion, right? So it has to be shrouded in philosophy and science, and this is where analytic idealism comes in handy.
hence it is just phenomenal. So I don't see how that, anyway.
It doesn't. It's another instance of question begging. In other words, is circular reasoning.
I have noticed, and it's just maybe some kind of habit, but he does say a lot of times, or Bernardo Kastrup use the terms "in other words" a lot. You can dig down into a presentation and check out how many times he says "in other words," right? I don't, and I mean it might be a habit of speech, right? I have mine. My habits, like I say right a lot. I've been told, right? Right? I can't help it, right? Right? But adding a word here and there, which is a habit like saying right, right, is different from saying this is question begging. In other words, and then go on and explain, right? That's the larger picture of so it's less of a speaking error rather than an expression that this is to some extent about how you phrase things. This is about using words to convince. I never say and a few times I might say in other words, right? if I try to explain something and I'm coming to some kind of cul-de-sac in my explanation, and then I try, okay, in other words, you might say it this way, or when I try to extrapolate myself and try to use it in other terms to explain things where I ended in a dead end, right? But he says, in other words, a lot. It's like 20, 30, 40 times during some interview like this, right? Maybe I'm overdoing it a bit, but it is a lot. It's more than it's rather the case than not the case, right? So it alludes to me that this is about picking and choosing terms to convince you about what it is they try to push on you, right? Rather than try to be strict about the terms used. If you always say, in other words, it is expressed as this is about words. This is linguistic shit. This is not philosophical shit as much, right? Or I guess it is philosophy. I mean, on the basic structure of it is, right? But if you constantly have to say in other words and then use some other words to explain the same thing, either it's because it's very difficult to explain what you're saying, or you're deliberately trying to throw words at me in order to convince me, right? And maybe give a straight up, in the first try, give me a straight up direct definition or a short version, but then quickly say in other words and then give a long version of it that throws words at me in a more sophist manner than the first one, right? And how is it all connected, you could say, right? If you take a bigger overview of this. And I think that, as it is with most, if not all, philosophers, they lose oversight of what they're doing. They don't have the grand overview of their philosophy, right? And you wouldn't want to have, for instance, my presentation of my ontology, and I'm working on a better this diagram than the one I've made here, which is kind of handheld, right? That is more structured and more a better overview and it better, which better expresses what I need to express and bring in as few terms as absolutely possible, right? So if I said, physics, or in other words, why would I say or in other words? Because I just used the term physics, right? Or science and the scientific method, or in other words, well, why do you need to bring in these other words? What is it? I mean, why haven't you optimized your use of terms? It's just, I've noticed this, right? And it's sort of kind of slightly annoying.
It's only obvious that feel and function cannot be separated if you make physicalist assumptions that function is the source of the feel or the generator of the feeling. Only under that assumption can you derive the conclusion that you cannot separate the two, because if one is the effect of the other, separating them is merely nominal, or at least it's a separation in time, but not a separation in essence. So yes, he is right in deriving that conclusion, but only if you start with physicalist assumptions, which of course is precisely the point in contention. You cannot argue against an alternative to physicalism by using the assumptions of physicalism in your argument. That's begging the question. That's circular reasoning. And let me give you another example of circular reasoning that physicalists make. They say, it is obviously not possible for there to be a mind outside human beings or outside living beings. Therefore, idealism is wrong, because there is obviously a world outside living beings, and that world then cannot be minded because there is no mind outside living beings. Well, but the notion that minds can only exist.
I don't
within-
know this is a straw man. I don't know. I can't tell you whether or not some physicalists say this. So I'll just let it be up to you to judge. If you use that argument, sure, it's begging the question, right? It's like saying, well, there are no elephants outside my wall here on the other side of this wall, so therefore there are no elephants. It's a stupid way of arguing, right? You decided there wasn't any, and therefore there wasn't any because you decided it, right? This stupid kind of argument. But it's again this, if this argument is used, it's an example of how prevalent, how incredibly prevalent, I would say, begging the question or taking things for granted is in the foundations of philosophy, right? I just took a sneak peek at one presentation of integrated information theory, right? And it is quite weird. I'm not quite sure what the hell they're trying to do there, right? I'm just having trouble understanding what they think they're doing. But there are a huge number of assumptions and possibly another suffering from the inside-outside paradox problem, right? That just because you imagine an external world doesn't mean you all of a sudden have access to an external world and can describe it. It's this problem of thinking that your imaginations are the actual thing that you're imagining. If I imagine an elephant outside this wall, it doesn't mean that I can start talking and measuring that elephant, right? That imagination is here on this side of the wall, right? They all suffer from this, taking their imaginations to all of a sudden being that thing they're imagining, and then they think they can measure and describe that thing they're imagining as if it was beyond their imagination. Bernardo Kastrup suffers from the same problem. They all suffer from this problem. This fetish of an external world is so hard to handle in a rigid manner, apparently for most people, and it was for me also until a few years ago, right? Where I suddenly realized, first of all, I realized that my physicalist assumptions were completely stupid, right? As Bernardo Kastrup and a few others are trying to point out, right? That you can't have an experience of something beyond your experience that then becomes your experience. It's stupid, right? But then rejecting that means that you're actually becoming solipsist. It doesn't mean that you can keep that external world you used to take for granted. You can't keep that, take that. Absolutely not, because what you just pointed out by pointing to this paradox that I keep referring to is that you don't have access to that external world. Where is it? I mean, if you have access to your experiences, good. But that means exactly you don't have access to anything but your experiences. So if you start talking about an external world, what the hell makes you talk about it? Because there's nothing about your experience that spells there must be something external to this, right? No matter how much you try to wiggle around it and try to, squeeze some kind of, sensual whatever, there's some outsideness to my experience. Well, no, that can't be because it's inside. So it can't be an outsideness, right? Appealing to a sixth sense or something like that, right? It very quickly becomes some kind of woo-woo because people are trying to force themselves into an argument for something they can't argue for, right? I'm still looking for somebody who claims access or the existence, maybe I should say, I'm not sure what term to put on it, right? But let's say existence of an external world. I'm still looking for somebody who can argue rigidly for it, right? In the sense that if you somehow take it for granted or something like that, you have to spell out how you get to it. If you can't argue for it, right, which is a hallmark of philosophy, then there's only one other option, which is starting with an axiom that says, I am working from the idea that there is an external world. I cannot argue for it. That's why I call it an axiom. But it's my philosophy. It's my axiom. You don't have to work with this axiom. Go be a solipsist if you want, for all I care, right? If you start to communicate with me, or I feel that you're communicating with me, I'm not going to treat you as a solipsist. But go be a solipsist if you want, right?
In living beings is a tenet of physicalism, not of alternatives to physicalism. Alternatives to physicalism would say that everything can be minded, everything can be a mind, and admitting that there is a world outside individual.
A mind, everything can be a mind. I mean, it's like, you know, there's one thing about idealists that I really don't like is it seems like they're more concerned about destroying your sense of rigidity and than trying to build something rigidly, right? They want to sort of screw around so they say everything can be mind. So you have to put your guards down and say, okay, I guess whatever I'm thinking is something that is guided by mind. Then I have to come back to Bernardo Kastrup asking, so how do you understand this? And that's apparently what he wants, right? The idea of monism is an appeal to the destruction of individualism, in my opinion, right? If you can be convinced about monism, that there's one thing to explain it all, right? It's like the ring of power in Lord of the Rings, right? You can't have an individual ring that you're working with, right? To stay with the Lord of the Rings analogy. You have to bow down to the one ring, which is mind. And therefore, monism is mind control, in my opinion. It's almost embedded in the language, right? Everything is controlled with mind, right? So it's mind control, right? Because if everything is one thing, you can't be allowed to have something different, right? I mean, you can't say, no, I have something different. It's not mind. It's something else, right? No. There's something wrong with you. You have to go to the gulags now, right? I'm very concerned about these idealists. And I have sensed that that's one of the reasons why I keep coming back to people like Bernardo Kastrup, because I have a very strong gut reaction that there is some potential unwanted, unneeded. It's a sort of a slippery slope of things that can go wrong, right? It ends up in something that inevitably will be a pile of dead people, as has been seen so often before, right? And one other thing that I am reminding myself of, that yes, Plato has been, everything else is a footnote to Plato, as they say, right? He basically covered all bases, and everybody else is just making footnotes to Plato. I would say that's a bit of a stretch, right? Because what did his kind of, there's one kind, there's the realm of the forms and whatever, right? Perfection. What did that end up in? The Republic, which is basically a mental dictatorship, where human beings are just treated like, crazy animals, right? And then only the particular philosophers who can see the light and have seen the forms and whatever can rule the world, right? If kings can't be philosophers, philosophers have to be kings then, right? I'm just concerned. No, I'm not saying Bernardo wants to be a king, anything like that. But it's not him I'm concerned about. It's all the fucking idiot crazy people who might, push this in some kind of weird direction, right? And misinterpret the understanding. And it's this, there's one thing. And if you don't adhere to this one thing, you are the problem, right? You're not allowed to be your own thinking being. You're being told what you are by saying you are a dissociated mind and you're just one fucking stupid dissociation. Who cares, right? I'm very concerned about it.
Individual minds does not entail or imply that such a world cannot be mental. For instance, you have thoughts. Your thoughts are mental. My thoughts are...
But you, first of all, what's a you? And how do you know that you is that some part of you that has that thinking? Or are you just taking for granted there's something outside yourself that has this thinking that you're referring to? How do you get to that? What about the problem of other minds? Or zombie problem or something like that, right? Are you just taking for granted? Well, you have to state these things somehow. You can't just throw it out there as if it's sort of given, right? It's an axiom you're working from then. Now, what makes a thought mental? How does that follow? If I have a thought, let's say I'm thinking about a tractor. I don't know why, but I'm thinking of a tractor now. I had a thought. Why is that mental? What makes it mental? What is mental? Mental can only be an abstract label that you have put on it. But just because you added a label to something, if I put a label on a tractor that says it's a movie category, then all of a sudden I could say, yeah, a tractor, and that is a movie. And then you have movie because you had tractor. But I just added this synthetic label of movie to my tractor. It doesn't make it so, right? Just because I have used to call my thoughts mental doesn't mean I all of a sudden is experiencing mental. It's these abstractions that are compounding. And then people start to think that they're describing mental just because they use the term mental on it, right?
outside your individual mind. From your perspective, my thoughts are external. Not only that, my thoughts...
Are they external? They can't be external, because if I'm thinking about thoughts and other people's thoughts, I have access to that thinking. That is also a thought about another thought. So that must be a part of my ontology. Otherwise, I couldn't access that idea, that imagination, that abstraction, what term you want to use, right? So it can't be external if I'm imagining it or I'm thinking about it, right? So even if I think something that I claim to be external, it must be internal. Otherwise, I can't think about it, right? And this leap that now I'm thinking about something external. Now I am in the external because I'm thinking about it. No, you can't do that. That's like sitting here imagining an elephant and then all of a sudden start to ride on that elephant or hug that elephant or ride, whatever, slap it in the ass or whatever, right? You can't do that. You can't jump. If you imagine an external world, doesn't mean you all of a sudden can jump out of your own experience, because that external world you're referring to is also an abstraction within that which you call your mind, right? It's a part of your ontology. You are never outside yourself, no matter how much you want to be, and no matter how simplistically abstract you make it to make it sound like it's some kind of access to some external world, right?
Thoughts are objective from your perspective because you could measure them.
Objective? I don't have... that's... oh my God, man, right? Okay. I have an idea that this object that I'm experiencing has a mind. I can't tell you Because of the zombie problem, whatever, the problem of other minds. If that's an experience, it must be inside me. Then, if anything, it's a part of my mind then. But that experience I have, which I maybe axiomatically have as a representation of something outside, or treating as a representation of outside, cannot have a mind because it's a part of my mind then. It cannot have a separate mind because it's something I experience. So whatever is represented out there, I cannot say what the hell is going on out there, right? If there is an out there, which I can only establish axiomatically. So now all of a sudden, that taking that representation and treating it as if it's an actual outside that has a mind and that is also objective of all things. Objective? I would like your definition of objective, mate, right? With reference to some kind of ontology of yours, which is basically also fucked up because everything is mind. And then all philosophy basically stops there, right?
And you cannot control my thoughts merely by wishing them to be different. And my thoughts will still be here when you are no longer there and we are no longer talking. My thoughts do not need your presence to exist. From your perspective, my thoughts are objective and external, but from their own perspective, they are intrinsically subjective and mental. They're thoughts, after all. So to acknowledge...
They're mental because they're thoughts. So when you have a thought, it's automatically mental. How does that follow? What's the argument? Why do you need that label mental? It's artificial. I have a thought there. What's the content of the thought? But that's the cognition tractor. Okay, but then it's mental. But why do I need to call it that? Right? I can experience the Eiffel Tower without calling it France. Right? I don't need to call it France. I can experience and think about the Eiffel Tower without calling anything France. Why would I need to call it France? You can do that, but it's not necessary to juggle around with the idea of the Eiffel Tower, right? So why do I need to bring in that mental thing? What is it? Are you saying it's because, my thought of a tractor is of the same kind as the thought of a melon? So it's because it's all mental. But that's the same kind of abstractions as matter, right? Then mental and matter, there is no difference, basically, right? Maybe the only difference is that mental seems to cover everything, while matter is only confined to physics, right? Which I would say is a more stringent way of approaching the idea of some kind of philosophical abstract superstring. Confine it to physics, but mental apparently covers everything.
An external mental world, under an idealist perspective, requires no more than...
So idealism is a perspective? It's not a philosophy or what? I mean, am I putting more meaning into what it says here from an idealist perspective? Yeah, if you have fucked with your mind and you think this way, the perspective is... No, I don't buy that kind of lingo, right?
Then to acknowledge that another person also has mental inner life outside your own mind. What the idealist...
How do I realize that? Because all I have is something that is my experience, to stay with that terminology, right? If I refer to something outside, it cannot be an outside. It must be an inside, otherwise I can't refer to it, right? Even if I imagine it to be outside, it's still inside because I'm imagining it. And if it's outside, how the hell could I experience it or imagine it? Because if I do that, it must be inside then, right? So he's violating this paradox of physicalists that he also criticizes. But then he takes a leap outside himself, just like metaphysicalists do, right? He just does it with something else than matter or, the physicalist approach, right? Which is maybe more naive, that he's just, living in his abstractions. And then he can say, okay, there are some abstractions out there instead, right?
Does is to not mistake the evidence for an external world beyond our individual minds for evidence of a world that is non-mental and is outside all minds. Because that's obviously a step too far. We don't have evidence for the latter. We only have evidence for the former. There is a world outside our individual minds. Not evidence for a world that is itself not
Hang on,
mental.
Nick. I need to hear that again.
And is outside all minds. Evidence an external world beyond our individual minds for evidence of a world that is non-mental and is outside all minds.
Sorry, I have to
What the
rewind a bit
idealist
more here.
perspective requires no more than to acknowledge that another person also has mental inner life outside your
Acknowledge? What do you mean acknowledge? You little peasant, you have to accept this because I say so. Is that what you're saying? Acknowledge? When I do philosophy, I don't acknowledge shit, right? I try to establish something from a ground floor, and I don't try to bring in more shit than I can based on that ground floor. I don't allow myself to cherry pick whatever, reduction base I have of my ontology, right? I try to argue for it, I try to work down to it, rather than just cherry pick it like you do, right? And say, my ground floor is everything, and it's one thing, which is stupid, right? But what is this? You acknowledge that there's things out there that has a mind? Is that your philosophy? You just acknowledge, right?
Your own mind. What the idealist does is to not mistake the evidence for an external world beyond our individual minds.
I need to hear that again. I have to be absolutely fucking clear what he's trying to say here.
Inside your own mind. What the idealist does is to not mistake.
What the idealist does is to not mistake. Well, if you're not, then you're not doing something if you're not mistaking. You are avoiding something, you're not doing something then, right? So you're avoiding a fallacy or something like that.
The evidence for an external world beyond our individual minds.
The evidence for an external world beyond our... I would like to fucking have that evidence. And you can also say, well, evidence is not an external world. Because it's evidence, according to his formulation here. Well, it's just like the external world has left something behind you can look at and say, aha, and therefore there was an external world and there is an external world. What is that leftover? What is that evidence lying there that he's referring to? And even if he calls it evidence, he has to interpret it as an evidence for whatever he says it is evidence of. Evidence of something is not that something. If I experience an elephant, I might say that's evidence of I'm close to Africa, right? Or India, maybe. India or Africa. Or a zoo. I might be close to Africa. That's evidence. But that elephant is not fucking Africa, is it? So what you're appealing to evidence that I should take for granted that it follows, but evidence can by its nature not be the thing it's evidence of. That's why you call it evidence. So you can't experience an external world. You're basically implicitly implying that you can't experience an external world. You can only have something you call evidence, which must be something you experience. Otherwise, there's nothing evident from it, because it's this craziness building this bridge to an external world, right? Using language. Now, first of all, I would like to have that evidence. Tell me about that fucking evidence, right? And even if he says he has evidence, he is just an experience. He's just a dial on my dashboard, right? So, in order for me to get that evidence, I have to be told that it's evidence of an external world. I don't experience a fucking external world. I have no evidence of an external world. But then I should trust that this dial over there that tells me about an external world, I have to trust that dial called Bernardo Kastrup, who says, hey, I have an objective mind out here that has evidence of that. Fuck you, man, right?
for evidence of a world that is non-mental and is outside all minds. Because that's obviously a step too far. We don't have evidence for the latter. We only have evidence for the former. There is a world outside our individual minds, not evidence for a world that is itself not mental. What is the evidence?
What? Hang on. What are you saying here? You don't have evidence of a world that is outside that is different, but you have evidence of a world outside that is the same. I don't get it, man. Right? It's like floating around in water, right? You're submerged, and you're saying, "Okay, there's water here. I think there's water beyond this water. There's nothing else. There's no other kind than water. But beyond this water, there's more water." There's more water that I don't have access to. I'm cut off from the other water, but I have some evidence in my water here that tells me there's more water beyond my water. Is it just me, or is this fucking crazy, right? What is it about this fucking external world that they have so much passion for? Because at the end of the day, I only have my own experiences, right? When I go to the grocery store, as I keep repeating, I have to look for fucking tomatoes, right? I'm not looking for ripples. I'm not looking for mind. I'm looking for tomatoes and bananas and rice and pasta and whatever, right? Peanuts. Elephants, maybe, right? So why the fuck would I care about this? It's all this circularity that is built into it. It's like, yeah, but let me go and figure out what it really is, right? At the end of the day, it's still the same old experience. You have to look for your fucking tomatoes, right? But I'm trying to figure out what it really is because I need some explanation of what is going on, right? The big mind. Why not stay concerned with your actual experience? Because that's what you have to work with. Why not clarify and classify that in your ontology so you have a full grasp of what you have to work with in your actual toolbox, right? I don't care what my hammer is made of really out there, if there is an out there. I still have to use my hammer in the way I treat my hammer, which is a potential representation of something else outside. But I have accustomed myself to using this particular cognition this particular way. So why wouldn't I be concerned about that rather than something that is beyond me, that I can never get to, that doesn't have any influence how I use that hammer, right? It's kind of crazy.
For that, there isn't such evidence. But for the physicalist, because under physicalist premises, mind is always created by a nervous system, there cannot be an external world that is mental. But again, this is circular reasoning. It only applies under the premises of physicalism, which are the very things in contention. The problem is that many physicalists, especially illusionists, people who derive from that period of darkness in human thought called behaviorism around the middle of the 20th century into the 60s and 70s. People who grew up academically in that philosophical school. Dennett is the second generation of that school now. It began one generation before him with Skinner, Skinner's black box and all that nonsense. So Keith is the third generation of that. If you grow up in that environment, it is psychologically impossible for you to think coherently about reality without physicalist assumptions. They cannot do that. It's too ingrained. It is impossible for them to understand that the evidence for an external world.
Well, if you're talking about evidence for an external world, which is very much sound like to me, I'm a little confused after this word salad you just presented. But you're talking about an external world. You're just saying it's mind. It's also mind, right? But the problem is not what it is, whether it's mind or something else. The problem is, how the hell do you get to that external world? I mean, what the hell is that evidence? And even if it's evidence, it's not an external world because you call it evidence, right? The smoking gun is an evidence of whatever murder, but it's not the murder you are waving around, it's the smoking gun, right? So what is the smoking gun for an external world? And is that enough to establish an external world? Because that smoking gun is about an interpretation and a scenario and it's, something that you have access to. So what's the connection between an evidence you have access to and all of a sudden to an external world? I can make that bridge, right? I can make that argument. You have to establish it as an axiom or some kind of other, as presented as a statement, as something you're working from without being able to argue for it. But because of your potential or because of your preferred philosophy, you need it in order to get further in your description of your philosophy. That would be fair. That would be honest, rather than this appeal to some kind of argument that is nowhere to be found. And appealing to some evidence for an external world without disclosing what that evidence actually is. That's disgraceful in my opinion, right? And I've been listening a lot to this dude, Bernardo Kastrup, and I've never seen any argument for that external world. It's there, right? That's not good enough for me.
World is not evidence for a non-mental world. For the same reason that the evidence that I too have thoughts outside your mind is not evidence for the non-mental nature of my thoughts. But they can't see that. They literally cannot see that. They cannot think coherently about the world without basing their thought processes on physicalist foundations. It's a strange psychological thing, but I'm convinced that it's real, because I don't think Keith Frankish is malicious. I don't think he's insincere.
I think
he does believe he's
I'm
nonsense.
kind of fed up with these criticism of illusionism, right? Then I think I'll stop this one here, or maybe I should go to 106. Let's take a more on illusionism, and see what's there, and then I'll stop this one. Come on. I hope it doesn't break down the recording. Maybe I should stop here before I have had a few troubles with my laptop. So maybe I should stop here and I'll check out in another in the next video whether I'm going to.
So he can deceive himself.
Okay.
And us.
So now it works. No, it doesn't work. No. I better stop here. So bye.